Imagine standing on the icy slopes of a snow-capped mountain. But this is not just any mountain. This is Mount Everest, the highest and most unforgiving peak on Earth. Hidden somewhere far above, beyond the clouds, is the summit. The air around you are so thin that each breath feels like a battle. Your heart races as you feel the biting cold seep through your layers, and your body shivers as the weight of the journey presses down on you. To even get here, you must have spent years preparing, training your body to endure the harshest conditions, and thousands of dollars acquiring gear that could endure the deadliest elements. But it's all worth it because you are about to do what very few women before you have ever done: conquer the highest peak in the world. But Everest doesn't care about your dreams, and the line between triumph and tragedy is razor thin.
I'm doing this thing because I wanted to give a message that follow your dream. You have one life, live your life.
I have reached 6 of the 7 summits, so of course now I have to reach the 7th.
And she says, I'm climbing Mount Everest. And I says, have you lost your mind?
From a climber whose harness failed at the most critical moment, to another who was left behind to face the worst fate imaginable, today's episode uncovers the deadly cost of confronting one of nature's most brutal challenges. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Let's begin with the tragic story of Marty Hoey, an experienced American climber who was on the brink of making history. Marty Hoey was not just a climber. She was a trailblazer, a woman who shattered barriers in the male-dominated world of high-altitude mountaineering. Born in 1951, Marty grew up in Washington State, where the rugged landscapes sparked her love for the outdoors. From a young age, she was drawn to the mountains, and her passion soon turned into a lifelong pursuit of climbing some of the world's most challenging peaks. Marty's early years in mountaineering were marked by a series of significant achievements that quickly established her as one of the leading female climbers of her time. In the 1970s, when women were rarely seen in the upper rank of this sport, Marty was already shattering this glass ceiling, having climbed some of the most challenging peaks in North America and beyond. She was known for her technical skill, endurance, and fearless approach, often tackling routes that many of her male colleagues found intimidating. Her climbing experiences led her to a prominent role at the National Outdoor Leadership School, NOLS, where she became one of the first female instructors. At NOLS, Marty was a mentor to many aspiring climbers, both men and women. She specialized in high-altitude expeditions, leading teams through the most challenging terrains and sharing her extensive knowledge of mountaineering. Her influence at NOLS helped to pave the way for more women to enter the field, and she became a role model for female climbers everywhere. But Marty's achievements didn't stop there. She was one of the first women to lead expeditions on major peaks like Mount Denali, and was a key figure in several groundbreaking climbs. Her leadership and expertise were widely recognized, and she became known for her ability to remain calm under pressure, which is a vital trait in the unpredictable world of high-altitude climbing. But despite all her accomplishments, Marty had one goal that had always escaped her: summiting Mount Everest, the highest and most famous peak in the world. But in 1982, she finally got a chance to cross that off her list when she was selected to be part of an elite American expedition led by Lou Whitaker. Now, this was not just going to be any expedition. Lou aimed to summit Everest through the West Ridge, one of the most challenging and dangerous routes on the mountain. The West Ridge is known for its technical difficulty, with steep, exposed sections that require climbers to navigate deceiving rock and ice. This route had only been successfully climbed a few times before, which made the expedition's choice of route particularly bold and ambitious. Lou Whitaker was a highly respected American mountaineer, so him leading the expedition was an important victory for American climbers on the world stage. Whitaker had already established his credentials by becoming the first American to summit the North Col route of Everest in 1963. His deep understanding of the mountain and his reputation for leadership and thorough preparation added significant weight to the 1982 expedition. The team Whitaker assembled was composed of some of the most experienced American climbers of the time, one of whom was Marty. If they were successful, that climb would place Marty in the history books as the first American woman to reach the summit of Everest.
I think it's going to be very interesting for everybody as an individual, too. I think that if I am physically and mentally prepared, that I'll have a chance. I think the mountain will determine who will be ready to climb.
The months leading up to the expedition were filled with rough preparation. Marty had trained tirelessly for this climb, pushing her body to its limits to ensure she was ready for the grueling climb. She carefully planned every detail, from her nutrition to the gear she would carry, knowing that on Everest, even the smallest oversight could be deadly. Her experience and attention to detail made her one of the most prepared members of the team. As the expedition progressed, Marty's determination was unshakable. The team faced the usual and expected challenges of Everest: extreme cold, high winds, and the ever-present risk of avalanches. But Marty was in her element, drawing on years of experience to navigate the mountain's treacherous slopes. By mid-May, the team was in a position to make their final push to the summit. Marty was just days away from achieving her dream. This, unfortunately, is where this story takes a dark turn. On May 15, 1982, Marty and the crew were at 26,200 feet on the north face of Mount Everest. Given Everest's peak height of about 29,035 feet, it is very conceivable that a day or two later, she would have stood a very good chance of becoming the first woman to reach the world's highest mountain. But it was not to be. As Marty was trying to navigate the Great Kulwa, a particularly sharp gully high on Everest's north face, a simple yet devastating mistake happened. The buckle on her safety harness came loose. In the thin air and in the middle of the chaotic winds, Marty lost her footing and fell. We can only assume that she didn't double-check the buckle in the heat of the exciting moment. At the time, harnesses had to be manually double-threaded, unlike harnesses today with buckles that automatically lock. In those high altitudes, this simple oversight led to Marty losing her footing and falling. Despite the team's best efforts to save her, Marty fell thousands of feet down the face of the mountain. Her companion Jim Wickwire wrote about the event in his memoir, Addicted to Danger, published in 1998. I heard a sudden pinging sound and turned my head to see Marty pitching backward, head down the icy slope. She rolled onto her side and tried to grab the rope, but slid past it and disappeared into the mist and over a vast ice cliff. Not once, Wickwire wrote, did she cry out. Marty Hoey's death was a devastating blow to the mountaineering community, particularly to the women who had looked up to her as a pioneer in the sport. She had broken through so many barriers, proving that women could not only participate in high-altitude climbing, but also excel at it. Her untimely death was a cruel reminder of the dangers that even the most experienced climbers face on Everest. Following the tragic loss of Marty Hoey in 1982, the lessons of Everest's dangers echoed through the decades, yet the mountain continued to lure female climbers from all corners of the world. Decades after Marty's fall, another determined climber embarked on her own journey up Everest. Like Marty, she was driven by the dream of reaching the summit. This is the story of Australian Maria Strydom. Maria Strydom was an accomplished academic and passionate adventurer with a deep love for the outdoors. Born and raised in South Africa before moving to Australia, Maria was a senior lecturer at Monash University, specializing in finance. Her professional life was marked by intellectual precision, but her personal life was driven by a passion for climbing. Maria and her husband, Robert Gropel, shared a dream of summiting the highest peaks on each continent, a challenge known to climbers as the Seven Summits Challenge. By 2016, they had already conquered 6 of these challenging mountains, with only Mount Everest remaining. For Maria and Robert, reaching the summit of Everest was more than a personal achievement. It was a statement. Both were firm vegans, and they wanted to challenge the misconception that a plant-based diet lacked the necessary nutrients for high-performance activities like mountaineering. By standing on top of the world, they hoped to prove that vegans could not only survive, but also thrive in extreme conditions. This journey was about more than just climbing. The couple arrived in Nepal in April 2016, full of hope and excitement. They joined an international team of climbers, each with their own dreams of reaching the summit. The team began their ascent in May, following the traditional South Col route. This route, though the most popular, also has its own dangers, from the deceitful Khumbu icefall to the bone-chilling winds of the death zone above 26,000 feet. As they ascended, Maria and Robert faced the typical challenges that Everest presents: the biting cold, the thinning air, and the physical exhaustion that comes with high-altitude climbing. Yet, they were well prepared, having spent years training for this moment. The couple moved steadily through the lower camps, acclimatizing as they went. Their spirits were high, and the summit seemed within reach. However, as they climbed higher, Maria began to experience the symptoms of altitude sickness.
She couldn't walk, and the terrain was very difficult. It was very steep and very rocky, and it was very risky.
Altitude sickness, or acute mountain sickness, AMS, occurs when the body is unable to adapt to the lower levels of oxygen available at high altitudes. The higher you go, the thinner the air becomes, and the body struggles to get the oxygen it needs. The first symptoms of AMS are often mild and include headaches, dizziness, nausea, and shortness of breath. These symptoms are common among climbers and can usually be managed with rest and acclimatization. But for some climbers, like Maria, these symptoms can escalate quickly, leading to more severe and life-threatening conditions. As they pushed further into the death zone, Maria's condition worsened. They call it the death zone. It's because oxygen levels are less than a third of what they are at sea level. Her headaches became more intense, and she began to feel increasingly fatigued. The lack of oxygen was taking a toll on her body, and she struggled to catch her breath. This progression is a clear warning sign that the body is not coping with the altitude, and continuing to ascend can be dangerous. Despite her worsening condition, Maria was determined to press on. The summit was provocatively close. She was just 15 minutes away from the summit, and she was unwilling to give up on her dream. However, realizing the seriousness of her condition, Robert and their Sherpa guides urged her to turn back. They knew that continuing could be fatal. But Maria, driven by her determination to reach the top, insisted that Robert continue to the summit without her. She believed she could manage her condition long enough for him to achieve their shared goal. Reluctantly, Robert agreed to her request, and Maria began her descent accompanied by Sherpas. However, as she descended from the South Col, Maria's condition started to worsen dramatically. Altitude sickness has now progressed to high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE, a severe and life-threatening condition where fluid builds up in the lungs, making it nearly impossible to breathe. HAPE is one of the most dangerous complications of altitude sickness, and it can develop rapidly, particularly in the thin air of the death zone. With each step, each breath became a hard task to tackle, and her energy drained away. The fluid in her lungs slowly suffocated her, and the lack of oxygen caused her body to shut down. Despite the best efforts of the Sherpas to assist her, her body was unable to cope with the extreme altitude. Maria collapsed on the descent. The Sherpas tried desperately to help her, but there was little that could be done. On May 20th, 2016, Maria Strydom died on the slopes of Mount Everest, just hours from the summit she had so long dreamed of. Maria's death sparked a global conversation about the immense pressures that climbers face, particularly those driven by the need to achieve something extraordinary. Maria wanted to break a record, but instead the mountain broke her. But as you know, hers is not the only tale of a climber who came agonizingly close to realizing their dream, only to have it snatched away by the mountain. Just 2 decades earlier, another climber faced a similar fate. Yasuko Namba was a determined and passionate climber from Japan, a woman who had set her sights on conquering the world's highest peaks. Born in 1949 in Tokyo, Yasuko was not your typical mountaineer. She was a businesswoman working as a management consultant for Federal Express in Japan. But beyond the boardrooms and business meetings, she had a deep love for adventure, and a relentless drive to push her physical and mental limits. By the time Yasuko decided to tackle Mount Everest, she was already an experienced climber. Her goal was to join the elite group of mountaineers who had completed the 7 Summits Challenge, which is climbing the highest peaks on each of the 7 continents. Everest, the tallest of them all, was to be her crowning achievement. At 47 years old, Yasuko Namba was not only one of the oldest women to attempt Everest, but she was also one of the most determined. Her journey to the summit was the result of years of preparation, training, and successful climbs on other challenging peaks. She had already conquered 6 of the 7 summits, including Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa and Denali in North America. Everest was the final piece of her mountaineering puzzle, the ultimate challenge that would complete her quest. Yasuko joined the 1996 Everest expedition led by Rob Hall, a seasoned mountaineer who had successfully guided many climbers to the summit. The team included experienced climbers, each with their own reasons for taking on the world's highest peak. Yasuko, though quiet and reserved, was firm in her ambition. Her goal was clear: to stand on top of the world and bring pride to her home country of Japan. The expedition began in early May, following the traditional South Col route, the same path taken by Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay during the first successful ascent in 1953. It was meant to be a normal routine trip to the peak. It turned out to be, in Hall's words, the worst experience of my life. As the team ascended, they faced the usual challenges of Everest, just like everyone I mentioned so far: extreme cold, fierce winds, and the ever-present threat of altitude sickness. But Yasuko was undeterred. Despite her age and the physical demands of the climb, she kept going, driven by her dream of reaching the summit. On May 10, 1996, after weeks of difficult climbing and acclimatization, Yasuko Namba finally stood on the summit of Mount Everest. She was the oldest woman at the time to achieve this feat, and she had done so with the quiet determination that had defined her entire mountaineering career. What a triumph! Yasuko and the team had spent time on the peak celebrating and enjoying the priceless view. Maybe they spent a little too much time on the peak. As they began their descent, they were caught in one of the deadliest storms in Everest's history. The weather, which had been relatively stable during the ascent, turned suddenly and violently. What began as a clear day quickly transformed into a nightmare as dark clouds rolled in, bringing with them fierce winds and heavy snowfall. The storm was wild, with wind speeds reaching up to 70 miles per hour. The snowfall was so heavy that the trail disappeared. It was nearly impossible for the climbers to see where they were going. The temperature visibility dropped to near zero, creating life-threatening conditions for those still on the slopes. The howling winds cut through the climbers' gear, and the thick snow made every step a battle for survival. Yasuko, already exhausted from the climb and the thin air at such high altitudes, struggled to keep up with the group as they made their way down. The storm intensified, and the climbers found themselves battling not just the mountain, but also the weather. Yasuko, who had pushed her body to its limits to reach the summit, began to waver. Her pace slowed down. She became increasingly disoriented and developed altitude sickness and fatigue. As night fell and the storm raged on, each member of the team was just trying to survive, think of themselves, and save their own lives. She and another climber, Beck Weathers, were left in the snow, huddled together in a desperate attempt to survive the night. The storm showed no mercy, and by morning Yasuko was unresponsive, her body succumbing to the cold and exhaustion. Despite their own situation, the surviving climbers tried to rescue Yasuko, but it was too late. She had died from exposure just hours after achieving her lifelong dream. Her body was left on the mountain as a tragic reminder of the high cost of ambition on Everest. Yasuko Namba's death was one of 8 fatalities during the 1996 Everest disaster, an event that shook the mountaineering world and led to widespread examination of commercial expeditions on the mountain. Her story shocked the world deeply because of her age and determination, but in particular because of the cruel irony of her fate. Yasuko had reached the highest point on Earth, only to lose her life on the way back down. Yasuko Namba's story is a haunting reminder of how close triumph and tragedy can be on Everest. But Yasuko was not the only climber whose dreams were crushed by the mountain's unforgiving nature. 2 years after her fateful ascent, another climber would face a similarly harrowing ordeal. Francys Arsentiev, an experienced mountaineer, made history by becoming the first American woman to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. But the cost of this achievement would be so devastating it continues to haunt climbers to this day. Francys Arsentiev, born in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1958, was an adventurer at heart with a deep passion for mountaineering. She was an experienced climber who had already summited several of the world's highest peaks. Alongside her husband, Sergei Arsentiev, a seasoned Russian mountaineer, Francys set her sights on the ultimate challenge, becoming the first American woman to summit Mount Everest without the use of supplemental oxygen. The couple shared a dream of conquering the world's tallest mountain by relying solely on their physical and mental strength. In 1998, after years of preparation and successful climbs, Francys and Sergei embarked on their expedition to Everest. The couple was well aware of the risks involved in attempting to summit without supplemental oxygen. This was a feat that only a few climbers had accomplished, for good reason. The lack of oxygen at such high altitudes places a huge strain on the human body, making every step a monumental effort. But Francys was determined to achieve this historic milestone and prove that it was possible. The couple joined a small group of climbers in May 1998, setting out on the challenging North Face route from Tibet. This route is known for its treacherous terrain, harsh winds, and brutal cold. The Arsentievs progressed steadily up the mountain. Their spirits were high as they approached the final leg of their journey. On May 22, 1998, Francys reached the summit of Everest, making history as the first American woman to do so without supplemental oxygen. It was a moment of triumph, a realization of a lifelong dream. But as you well know by now, the descent from Everest is often more dangerous than the ascent, and the Arsentievs quickly found themselves in a risky situation. The thin air, extreme cold, and physical exhaustion began to take their toll on Francys. Her movements slowed and she struggled to maintain her balance. The lack of oxygen was wreaking havoc on her body, impairing her judgment and weakening her muscles. The couple became separated in the chaos of the descent, a common occurrence in the disorienting environment of the death zone, where survival instincts often take superiority over rational decision-making. Sergei, descending ahead of Francys, made it as far down as Camp 4, over 2,000 feet below the summit, before realizing that his wife was not with him. Panic set in as he understood the seriousness of the situation. Without hesitation, Sergei turned back, climbing back up the mountain in a desperate attempt to find Francys. He knew the risks of retracing his steps in the death zone, where every minute spent at such high altitudes increases the danger, but he was driven by a fierce determination and love to reach his wife. As night fell on May 22nd, Francys found herself alone on the upper slopes of Everest. The temperature dropped, and the wind howled around her, cutting through her layers of protective clothing. She was stranded in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, with no shelter and no way to call for help. The cold was relentless, and the lack of oxygen made it difficult for her to think clearly. Despite her dilemma, Francys pressed on, hoping to make it down to a lower camp where she could find safety. Unfortunately, Sergei's selfless act of love would cost him his life. While attempting to rescue Francys, Sergei gave in to the extreme conditions of the mountain. His body was later discovered on the mountain, not far from where Francys had been stranded. His departure was a testament to his unwavering commitment to save his wife, even in the face of overwhelming circumstances. Meanwhile, Francys was enduring a slow and agonizing decline. The cold seeped into her bones, and the lack of oxygen caused her body to shut down. She was now suffering from hypoxia, a condition where the brain is deprived of oxygen, leading to confusion, hallucinations, and loss of coordination. Despite her weakened state, Francys clung to life, determined to survive. On May 23, 1998, a team of Uzbek climbers stumbled upon Francys. She was alive, but barely. The climbers tried to help her, giving her oxygen and attempting to move her down the mountain, but she was too weak to walk, and they were too exhausted to carry her. They faced an agonizing decision: risk their own lives to stay with Francys or leave her behind to save themselves. With heavy hearts, they chose to descend, knowing that Francys would likely not survive the night. The next day, Francys was discovered again, this time by British climbers Ian Woodall and Cathy O'Dowd. They found her lying in the snow, still clinging to life but unable to speak or move. Her eyes were open and she appeared to be aware of her surroundings, but she was too weak to respond. Woodall and O'Dowd tried to help her, but it was clear that she was beyond saving. They stayed with her for as long as they could, offering what little comfort they could provide in such a terrible situation. Eventually, they were forced to leave her, knowing that she would not survive much longer. Francys Arsentiev died alone on Everest, her body succumbing to the cold and lack of oxygen. Her death was a tragic end to what should have been a moment of triumph. Francys had achieved her goal of summiting Everest without supplemental oxygen, but the cost was her life. For years, her body remained on the mountain, lying peacefully in the snow, earning her the nickname Sleeping Beauty among climbers who passed by her on their own ascents. It wasn't until 2007, nearly a decade later, that her body was finally moved off the main route, in an effort led by climber Woodall, who had been haunted by the memory of finding her. Her story continues to resonate within the mountaineering community as a sad reminder of the dangers of high-altitude climbing. Francys Arsentiev's story is a great reminder of how Everest can turn triumph into tragedy in an instant, even after a successful summit. But Francys was not the first climber to face such a sad fate on this mountain. Nearly 2 decades earlier, another woman made history on Everest, only to find herself trapped in a similar struggle for life on her descent. This is the story of Hannelore Schmatz, whose final moments on Everest left a haunting legacy that would linger on the mountain for years to come. Hannelore Schmatz was a determined and adventurous woman, a climber whose passion for the mountains took her to some of the world's most challenging peaks. Born in Germany, Hannelore was not content with the ordinary. She sought out challenges that pushed her limits, and by the late 1970s, she had established herself as an experienced high-altitude mountaineer. Alongside her husband, Gerhard Schmatz, she had climbed some of the world's most challenging mountains, but there was one peak that called to her above all others: Mount Everest. In 1979, Hannelore and Gerhard joined an international expedition to climb Everest, with the goal of summiting via the South Col route. At 50 years old, Gerhard Schmatz was the oldest person at the time to attempt Everest, and Hannelore, at 39, was among the few women to dare the climb. The expedition was led by Gerhard himself, and it included a small team of experienced climbers, each determined to reach the summit of the world's highest peak. The Schmatz expedition progressed steadily, overcoming the many challenges that Everest presented. The team acclimatized as they ascended, setting up camps along the way, and by late September, they were in position for their final push to the summit. The weather was relatively stable, and spirits were high as the climbers prepared for the tough climb ahead. For Hannelore, this was the highest of years of preparation and training, a chance to achieve her dream of standing on the roof of the world. On October 2, 1979, Hannelore Schmatz reached the summit of Mount Everest, becoming the first German woman to do so. It was a historic achievement, one that should have been celebrated. But as is so often the case with Everest, the descent proved far more dangerous than the climb. Exhausted from the ascent and the thin air at the summit, Hannelore and her team began their descent down the South Col. The conditions were brutal. The altitude was affecting her judgment, and she was beginning to show signs of severe exhaustion. Hannelore was struggling to keep up, her movement slowed and labored. As the team descended, It became clear that they were in serious trouble. The team was also running out of daylight, and they knew that descending in the dark would be incredibly dangerous. They made the difficult decision to stop and camp for the night at an altitude of around 27,200 feet, just below the South Pole. The decision to stop was very risky. At that altitude, the human body is slowly dying, and spending a night exposed to the elements can be fatal. Despite the danger, Hannelore and the team set up a makeshift camp, huddling together to conserve warmth. But the cold was relentless, and the thin air offered little comfort. Hannelore's condition worsened as the night wore on. She was suffering from exhaustion, hypothermia, and altitude sickness, a deadly combination that was rapidly draining her strength. She tried to rest, but the harsh conditions made it impossible. As the hours passed, Hannelore's body began to shut down, and she became increasingly disoriented. In the early hours of October 3, 1979, Hannelore Schmatz succumbed to the extreme conditions. Her final words, reportedly spoken to a Sherpa companion who stayed by her side, were chilling. They were, "Water, water." She then closed her eyes and passed away, her body coming to rest just a few hundred feet below the summit she had so heroically reached. The other climbers had to leave her behind as they descended, knowing that they could not carry her body down the mountain. Hannelore's death was a profound tragedy, but her story did not end there. Her body remained on Everest, lying where she had fallen, frozen in time. Over the years, Hannelore's body became a marker on the South Pole route, her lifeless form sitting upright, frozen in place as if she were still resting against her backpack. Her body was so well preserved by the cold that, from a distance, it appeared as though she was simply sitting there, taking a break. Many climbers, upon seeing her, mistook her for a tent, only realizing the truth when they got closer. Her presence on the mountain was a sad reminder of the dangers that Everest holds, even for the most experienced climbers. The image of Hannelore, sitting upright against her backpack, her hair blowing in the wind, became one of the most haunting sights on Everest, until high winds eventually blew her remains off the trail and down the mountain. Even today, her story remains a powerful symbol of the deadly allure of Everest and the thin line between success and danger on the world's tallest mountain. But sad as Hannah's story may be, it's not even the worst Everest has to offer. Our next and final story is of a female climber whose journey to the summit ended in one of the mountain's most heart-wrenching tragedies. Shriya Shah-Klorfine was a woman driven by an unyielding determination to achieve her dreams, no matter the cost. Shriya was born in Kathmandu, Nepal, and had always harbored a deep admiration for the world's highest peak, Mount Everest. Growing up in the shadow of the Himalayas, she was captivated by the stories of those who had dared to challenge the mountain's tough heights. But for Shriya, Everest was a lifelong dream that she was determined to realize, even if it meant facing undefeatable odds. She later moved to Canada, but her dream of Everest never faded. In 2012, at age 33, Shriya decided it was time. She joined an expedition led by Utmost Adventure Trekking, a new company with no track record of guiding climbers to Everest's summit. She chose them based on family connections in Nepal, despite their inexperience. Her preparation? Running and indoor rock climbing for 2 years. She had never scaled any major peaks, and Everest would be her first significant climbing challenge.
She don't have nothing mountain experience.
So how on earth could you expect that she could make it?
Even during the month-long training, she underperformed, but she never wavered. "I can do it. I can do it. I can do it," she told anyone who asked.
I talk with her, every time she say, "I can do it. I can do it. I can do it."
From the start, there were red flags. Her pace was slow, much slower than her peers, and even the company's most senior Sherpa guide refused to take her beyond base camp.
She's slow, that's everybody know.
But Shriya was undeterred. On May 18, 2012, at 7:30 p.m., she started her summit push with 2 less experienced Sherpa guides. As she climbed, She ran into the expedition's owner, Ganesh Thakuri, who was coming down from the top. He noticed her oxygen was low and tried to convince her to turn around. Shriya refused, so Thakuri gave her his last bottle of oxygen and let her keep going. By morning, Shriya was visibly weak. Extended exposure to Everest's death zone was draining her, and her guides warned her to turn back. But she pushed on, driven by the goal she'd held for so long. On May 19, 2012, after 22 hours of climbing, Shriya Shah-Klorfine achieved her dream as she stood on the summit of Mount Everest. She was the fourth woman and the first South Asian woman from Canada to stand at the top of Everest. But the victory was fleeting. As Shriya made her way down from the summit, it was clear she was drained. Shriya had used much more oxygen than planned during the ascent, and the thin air at those altitudes was suffocating. She eventually ran out completely. The lack of oxygen was causing her body to shut down, and every step became a huge effort. Shriya continued to push forward, driven by the determination that had brought her to the summit in the first place. But as the hours passed, it became clear that she was in serious trouble. Her Sherpas tried to get her down, even physically supporting her and urging her to keep moving, but she was so tired she couldn't even stand on her own. As night fell, Shriya's condition got worse. She was now suffering from severe exhaustion and hypoxia, just like Francys was. The cold was relentless, and Shriya's body was beginning to surrender to the extreme conditions. Despite the best efforts of those around her, Shriya could go no further.
त्यो भने हामीले क्यामेरा मुखमा यति मध्ये आउँथ्यो कि हिन्नु दिदी हिन्नु दिदी हिन्नु सिरा दिदी हिन्नु सिरा दिदी पीर परिसक्दा रात परिसकेको थियो पीर चाहिँ अति धेरै पीर भइसकेको थियो.
Save me, she reportedly pleaded to her guides, but there was nothing more they could have done. At 10 p.m., Shriya Shah-Klorfine died on the slopes of Mount Everest on May 19, 2012, just hours after achieving her lifelong dream. Her death sparked a global conversation about the dangers of commercial expeditions on Everest, where climbers, driven by the desire to reach the summit, often ignore the signs of impending disaster. Her story is a reminder that Everest, for all its allure, is a place where dreams and lives are often lost in the pursuit of glory. Is climbing Everest really worth the possibility of never returning? Let me know what you think in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.